PH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and let's talk about the colorless options for Commander. I've done this quite a bit on my channel. I actually did a whole playlist of colorless options for your deck. I talked about card draw and removal and ramp and all that good stuff, and I did it back then mostly because certain colors have issues dealing with certain things. Some colors aren't so great at card draw, some colors aren't so great at removal, so having colorless options is great, obviously, because they can go in any deck, and certainly that is the case still. However, I'm doing another video about this because we've gotten a lot of really great colorless commanders in the format lately, so I thought it would be a good time to revisit it, right? We got Liberator, Urza's Battlethopter from Brothers War, we got the Peregrine Dynamo from Dominaria United, and then just recently we got Graz Unstoppable Juggernaut from Phyrexia All Will Be One, which people seem to like a whole lot. So I thought it would be a good time to sort of bring all of this together. For me, the biggest advantage for a colorless deck is the lands. This is by far the biggest advantage that a colorless deck has. I mean, obviously there's a lot of drawbacks to it because there's so many cards you can't play. The lands, though, is the big upside for me. Of course, because you don't need any specific colors, you can put all those fantastic utility lands that are available for us in the format. There's a bunch of great ones. I did a list of the top 30 utility lands in the format. It's an older video. I did it about 2 years ago, so obviously it could be updated. There's a lot of really great lands that have come out recently that we could add to it as well. But a huge upside for colorless decks is that you can just pack your deck full of fantastic utility lands that are going to be tapping for the mana you need, right? Because you only need colorless mana, but then are going to give you this nice upside as well. So if I'm making a colorless deck, the first thing I'm going to go through is all those utility lands that I can shoehorn into my deck that are going to be solving issues for me. And I will be getting to more of them as I get to the specific things that we need in our deck, right? I'm going to go through the list of things that you need in a commander deck. So for example, ramp is something that you need in a commander deck, and colorless does have quite a few great options here. Again, I made a list of this a while ago. Wayfarer's Bauble, one of the most popular ramp options in the format, obviously can go in your colorless deck. Sword of the Animist, one of the most popular equipment in the format. Another great way to get lands out of your library. Of course, we're going to need basic lands here, and in your colorless deck, that's going to have to be wastes, right? Waste is a basic land that produces colorless mana. You're going to need a few of those in your deck for sure, especially if you want to be ramping, because a lot of the colorless options for ramping are going to be searching for basics, and you're going to need the waste in order to use them. So ramping, I don't think is a huge issue in a colorless deck. There are a decent amount of options that you can use, so I don't think that's going to be a huge drawback for you. Let's talk about card draw. Obviously something that you definitely are going to need in any commander deck, and colorless again does have quite a few decent options for you, but it always depends on what you're doing. Whether it be a colorless deck or any combination of colors, anything you're doing in your deck with regards to card draw for me is going to be dependent on what I'm doing in my deck. I want my card draw to synergize with whatever I'm already doing in my deck, right? So if you happen to be playing a life gain theme in a colorless deck, obviously Well Lost Dreams is going to be a great option for you. However, I doubt that's going to be the case if you're making tokens in your colorless deck. Idol of Oblivion is a great card draw option. Again, though, I don't know if there's a lot of colorless decks that are doing that. Generically good card draw option is probably what we want. Stuff like Investigator's Journal or Endless Atlas. These are just going to draw us cards no matter what we're doing in our deck. That's probably the kind of stuff you want to look at. Mind's Eye, for me, I think is probably the best colorless card draw option. I still think it's a pretty good card draw option in a lot of commander decks, but specifically in a colorless commander deck, this is your best option because it's not really relying on anything at all. All you need is your opponents to be drawing cards, right? Whenever an opponent draws a card, you may pay one. If you do, draw a card. This is guaranteed card draw. There is no way your opponents are not going to be drawing cards. And even though it's 5 mana, for me, I want to be drawing cards more so later in the game. I don't need my card draw options to be really cheap because later in a game is when I want to be refilling my hand, and Mind's Eye is really the best option there in a colorless deck because you slap it down and then you just wait until your opponents draw cards, pay 1 mana, draw a card yourself. So that's one of the best options. I did a video a while ago about colorless card draw options, but it probably needs to be updated because we've gotten a lot of great colorless options recently, like Reckoner Bankbuster or Weatherlight Completed. These are pretty decent card draw options for a colorless deck, I think. Again, it kind of depends on what you're doing a little bit. Symmetry Matrix, again, another one from Brothers War that is a pretty decent colorless card draw option. Whenever a creature with power equal to its toughness enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 1. If you do, draw a card. So this might fit what you're doing in your deck. It might not. If it does, it is a pretty good colorless card draw option. So we do have pretty good support here in colorless for card draw. Even the lands, again, are going to give us card draw option. Bonder's Enclave and War Room are both great card draw options in a colorless deck. With Bonder's Enclave, you just need to have a creature with power 4 or greater. That shouldn't be too difficult. And of course, War Room is going to be extra good here because you're going to pay 3 and tap, pay life equal to the number of colors in your commander's color identity, which of course is none at all, and you get to draw a card. So this is just pay 3 mana, draw a card on a land. Fantastic option in a colorless deck. So we do have a lot of great options for colorless decks here. I don't think it's going to hold you back at all. Let's talk about the removal. Again, something that you absolutely need in your commander deck. And this is where you're going to have a little bit of a drawback, just a little bit. Again, it might depend on what you're doing in your deck. We got some great new options here in Fraying Line and False Floor. They are specific in what they're doing, and they might not exactly work with your deck, but they are great colorless board wipe options for your deck. Probably the best though are Oblivion Stone and Nevinril's Disc. These are ones that are good enough to put in non-colorless decks, obviously, right? These have been played in the Commander format for a long time, especially in colors that don't necessarily do the board wipe thing very well. Dealing with artifacts, enchantments, and creatures and other things as well is really great to have stapled on one card in a colorless option, so we can fit these in our decks as well. If you're looking for board wipe options in your colorless deck, again, if we're getting a little bit more specific, Aligned Hedron Network is one that I kind of like a lot. 4 mana artifact. When Aligned Hedron Network enters the battlefield, exile all creatures with power 5 or greater until Aligned Hedron Network leaves the battlefield. So this is a neat little sort of pseudo board wipe that can work really well in your colorless deck if you have a low power theme. Now, a lot of colorless decks have a more high powered theme, right? This is obviously not going to work very well with Graz because it's going to exile all your creatures, but it might work a lot better in a Liberator Urza's Battlethopter deck where you have probably more of a low to the ground theme. And if you're doing so, it can be a one-sided board wipe in a way where it can get rid of all your opponent's big creatures and you'll be perfectly fine. We do have a couple of targeted removal options as well, like Introduction to Annihilation and Scour from Existence. But this is certainly one place where you're going to be hurting in your colorless deck is the targeted removal. There's not a ton of great options. Obviously, paying 7 mana to exile a permanent is a lot of mana, but you're gonna need to put this in your colorless deck, I think, because you're always gonna run into those situations where you're gonna need to get a certain permanent off the battlefield. So these are not super fantastic options, but they are cards that I think you probably need to include in your colorless deck because you're gonna need targeted removal and there just isn't a bunch of options in colorless form. The best way though to deal with your opponent's stuff that is going to advantage you, All Is Dust and Ugin the Spirit Dragon. These are great colorless options for board wipes that are going to advantage you because they're probably not going to be hurting you at all, right? All Is Dust is going to make everyone sacrifice their colored permanents, which isn't going to affect you at all. And with Ugin the Spirit Dragon, you have that +2, which is dealing 3 damage to any target, which is removal, right? You can get one of your opponent's pesky creatures off the battlefield, but the -X is really what you want this card for in your colorless deck. Exile each permanent with mana value X or less. That's 1 or more colors. So again, not going to hurt you at all in a colorless deck. Both of these cards are unbelievably huge card advantage in a colorless deck. It is really hard not to put these guys, at least one of them, in your colorless decks because this is going to be such a massive advantage for you in a commander game. So I would say pretty good on the removal front for colorless. We do have a lot of options here. Again, I have a video that I already did where I talk about some more options there. There are quite a few. And I'll quickly talk about counter spells because there's actually a couple of those as well. Warping Whale and Not of This World. Really interesting colorless counter spell effects. Warping Whale, you can pay 1 and a colorless mana. It's an instant, of course, and you can choose one. So it's modal. Exile target creature with power or toughness 1 or less. That's pretty usable. A lot of creatures that you can hit with that. You can create a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token with sacrifice this creature, add 1 colorless. So it is sort of a ramp option a little bit, but more importantly, counter target sorcery spell. For me, that is an ability that is worth putting in actually decks that aren't colorless at all. I have this in a mono white deck myself. Sorceries tend to be really powerful, right? A lot of the board wipes are going to be sorceries. A lot of the really powerful game ending spells like Insurrection or Expropriate, they're sorceries. So this is actually a pretty decent option as far as counter spells go, and not of this world. I have touted on this channel quite a bit. I think it's a fantastic include in any deck where you have a commander that is power 7 or greater, because it's a 7 mana spell and you counter target spell or ability that targets a permanent you control, but it costs 7 less to cast if it targets a spell or ability that targets a creature you control with power 7 or greater. So if you have that commander with a power 7 or greater, this is just a free counter spell to protect your commander, and we always want to be protecting our stuff in a commander game. So this doubles as a counter spell, but also as a protection spell. And especially if you have some of those giant colorless creatures that cost a lot of mana, you don't want your opponents to be removing them right away. So this just seems like an auto include for me in a lot of those colorless commander decks. Let's talk about Graveyard Hate, something again that you absolutely need in your commander deck, I think. And again, we got some pretty decent options here. Of course, we can do it in land form. Scavenger Grounds is a card that I'm going to put in all of my decks pretty much. And because it's a colorless land, it can go in that colorless deck as well. So that for me is a no-brainer in a colorless deck. We also have a lot of great colorless options for Graveyard Hate. If you want to be exiling your opponent's graveyard, or if you just want to be hating on graveyard strategies in general, I think it's entirely likely that if you're playing a colorless deck, you're not going to be doing a graveyard strategy. I can't really think of any ways that you could do that. So it is very easy for you to put a lot of those just straight up Graveyard Hate cards in your deck. That's probably the best way to go if you're making a colorless deck. Just throw a few of those in your deck, and when they come down, they're just going to hate on graveyards in general, and they're probably likely not going to hurt you at all. Another thing you might want to be doing in your commander deck that of course does work great in the format is Tutoring. And again, it's something that colorless does okay, not super great, but there are some pretty good options. Again, I did a video about this a while back about colorless tutor options. There are quite a few, and it's something you might want to look to be putting in your colorless deck. We do have decent options like Sentinel Flute, which will go get creatures, or Planar Portal, which will go get any card out of your deck. It is expensive, right? A 6 mana card that you then have to pay 6 and tap to search your library for a card. That seems like a lot of mana, but it is repeatable. That's pretty good. Just paying 6 mana to go get any card of your library is not that bad, I don't think. And again, we are in colorless, so we can't be picky here. You don't absolutely need tutors in your commander deck, of course, but if you are looking for options in your colorless deck, there are a few that you can go for. So there you go, a bunch of colorless options. Again, the things that you want to be looking for in your commander decks, right? We have a lot of great colorless commanders coming out recently, and so people might be looking for the options that they can have when they're putting their colorless deck together. Of course, one of the most important things about this entire format is you are relegated to the colors of your commander's color identity, and in a colorless deck, that means you can only choose colorless cards, but we're pretty good here, I think. And again, they've come out with a lot of cards recently. I do have a playlist of colorless options, but you can add in these new cards that have come out in the last couple of years. I think you're pretty good. You're pretty good on the ramp, you're pretty good on the card draw, and you even got some counter spells and some tutoring as well. So good luck with your colorless deck. I love the challenge, for me personally, of building a commander deck without access to any other colors. I find it to be pretty interesting, and my hat's off to anybody who is doing so. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.